so quickly. That's so helpful to us. What we'd like to do today, I hope you saw the email with the format, is the proponent starts and has 4 minutes. Then the opponent starts and has 4 minutes. Then it goes back, rebuttal for the proponent, 4 minutes. And then the opponent, rebuttal, 4 minutes. Then because of who both of you are in the community, a couple questions, because it's rare we get a chance to talk to either of you at such high standing. So with that, you would be our starter. And hang on a second, Mary Eliza, you do the count for 4 minutes. And could you tell Mr. Tumlin when he should start?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I'll get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Jeffery Tumlin. I'm San Francisco's Director of Transportation, but I'm here tonight as a 30-year resident of San Francisco, and I'm here to talk about Proposition A. Prop A is a renewal of Muni's general obligation bond. This is a $400 million bond, which is, again, a renewal of our previous tax. And because it is part of the city's capital program, it does not increase taxes. So it's the city's policy to only issue new bonds when old bonds are paid off within the 2006 cap. And this program is included therein. It also is a very different approach to our previous capital program, which was really focused on big projects. We have learned some hard lessons from Central Subway and Van Ness. This general obligation bond is focused primarily on speed and reliability improvements for the existing system, as well as safer streets and more smooth flowing traffic. It also includes a pretty significant commitment to basic state of good repair work for our transit facilities, many of which have had no attention paid to them for many decades, particularly our Potrero and Presidio yards, Presidio being over 100 years old and in serious seismic disrepair. It includes some major investments in a new train control system for the subway. Our current train control system is loaded off of 5¼ inch floppy disks. And then a lot of upgrades to our existing transit lines, projects like we've done in the 5 Fulton and the 9 San Bruno. We want to upgrade the Enjuta to be fully wheelchair accessible and to have reduced delays to traffic signals. We want to upgrade traffic signals citywide so that we can keep the traffic flowing more smoothly, as well as prioritize buses. They're not stuck at red lights. And then there's a huge investment in street safety, particularly for pedestrians. A lot of neighborhood traffic calming to be able to clear out the significant backlog we have of neighborhood traffic calming requests. Throughout, there's also an ongoing commitment to equity. We have underinvested historically in certain neighborhoods in San Francisco, both the West Side as well as neighborhoods like the Mission, the Southeast, Chinatown, Treasure Island, and the Ingleside. And then again, this general obligation bond is closely tied to the city's operating budget, which is a whole other topic, which we're talking to the Board of Supervisors about tomorrow. But that operating budget seeks to reverse the deferred maintenance program that we've relied on every time Muni has run into financial problems. So from here on forward, what I'm trying to do is to clear out decades-old deferred maintenance problems while shifting our operating budget so that we actually maintain our existing facilities. And this includes significant investments, for example, in fleet maintenance so that our vehicles last longer, and using the operating budget to do better
30 seconds.
Better regular maintenance of all of our services. Actually, with that, why don't I just go ahead and close so that we can have plenty of time for questions. Thank you so much for your time.
Okay, Larry.
Thank you.
You ready, Maury? So when you say when,
Hang on. I would ask that you give me a moment to get screen share working before you start the timer, please. Is that okay?
Yes.
Sure.
Thank you so much. Now, let's see. Okay, if screen share is working, you still see me.
Yes, go.
Well, hang on a moment. My apologies for this taking me just a moment. Okay, would you please start the timer? Thank you so much. I'm going to start spending a moment talking about the financial aspects of San Francisco's general obligation bond program. San Francisco, this is a snapshot of the 10-year capital plan. San Francisco's voters have approved $5.6 billion in general obligation bonds since 2008, more than in the 50 years of general obligation bonds combined. As you can see, in just the last few years, this included a $600 million affordable housing bond and about 245 for homeless services, which are not generally considered infrastructure. Coming up ahead, we have general obligation bonds for waterfront safety and earthquake safety, important infrastructure projects that require we have sufficient general obligation bond capacity. Is this a tax increase? Well, keep in mind, this is the front page of a bond prospectus. Tax upon taxable property in the city without limitation as to tax rate or amount. The tax here is a 1% rate plus the amount needed to pay voter approved general obligation bonds. What are these rates? These are the rates. This is the 2020 to 2021 rate. Take a look. I'm tabbing down. Note how the rates have been rising. The idea that the rates have been stable is a talking point that is misleading by the city. This is a chart also from the 10-year capital plan. 2022 is historically, we have a lower rate, and this is a 15% increase in general obligation bond-related property taxes forecast by the city, and it is the direct result of Proposition A. The $4 billion number there is the amount of principal and interest to be paid by San Francisco taxpayers. And I want you to take a look at this. The municipal bond rate, what has happened to it just this year. All of the forecasts that you have seen were calculated in June, which is at the low point of this curve. This is what has happened to the municipal bond rate in the last few months. It is skyrocketing, which renders all of the forecasts regarding Proposition A to be nonsense. Regarding Transportation 2050, I'd like to comment on operating revenues versus projections. Revenues adjusted downward for the pandemic. Expenditures projected to be on exactly the same line as before the pandemic. Did you hear Mr. Tumlin address the pandemic? I didn't hear him mention the word. This is a pre-pandemic plan for pre-pandemic capital investment. None of the numbers on this chart are in the bond. None of these categories are in the bond. This is a $400 million blank check to Muni. It can be spent on anything. It can be spent reproducing the mistakes that Mr. Tumlin spoke about. All we're looking at are the latest plans of Muni. And as we know, the SFMTA revises its plans constantly. And take a look at this. This is the marketing we're already seeing for the upcoming sales tax that will be on the November ballot. It's exactly the same marketing that we're hearing for this bond. Thank you. Oh, let me reverse the screen share.
And let me know when I should begin the rebuttal. Mari, you're muted.
George, are you?
Sorry,
ask them-
now.
Okay. So thank you for that, Larry. Let me correct some mistruths that Larry put forward. So first of all, the most important thing to understand is that the city has an overall capital program. In that capital program, which is updated every 2 years, are all of the projects in the eligibility categories for capital expenditures across the city. While $400 million of bonds are authorized by this measure, those bonds don't get issued if we run up against the property tax limitations that the city manages to. So this is an authorization; it's not a requirement. And while we're still getting an extraordinarily good interest rate that has been stable at 1.x%, which is phenomenally cheap for raising money. Yes, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Times are tough economically, but even so, the SFMTA during the pandemic still got an excellent bond rating that allows us to continue borrowing money at very cheap rates, far cheaper than if we had used our operating funds in order to make these investments. I also want to emphasize that our capital program is entirely developed during the pandemic. We have radically changed our approach to Muni, rebuilding the entire Muni system 7 times just over the last year and a half in response to pretty dramatic changes in travel behavior. But one thing that hasn't changed is the state of good repair of the system. We've known for decades that we need to invest in our transportation facilities, and the lack of investment in our facilities is costing us a fortune in wasted money of extra maintenance and slower and less reliable transit service. So I can assure you once again, and please feel free to check in with the controller's office if you don't believe me, this bond measure does not raise taxes. And what it does is it saves us a fortune in operating costs over time, particularly around maintenance. The other thing that it does is it makes us eligible for a significant amount of federal capital funds. So the infrastructure bill that was passed nationally requires a local match. In order for us to be eligible for those funds, we need local capital funds in order to match them, in order to invest in state of good repair for our facilities, which is something that throughout the pandemic, San Francisco voters have continued to tell us was a major priority. And again, since I probably have a little bit of extra time, I do want to emphasize that this capital program is very much matched up against our pandemic level operating budget. We are in a recovery mode. It was only 2 months ago that it was announced that we were getting enough federal relief funding to actually be able to start fully restoring Muni service. I have 1,200 vacancies that I need to fill in order to do that. And one key thing that I need is to be able to have access to capital funds to improve the efficiency of the system so that I can deliver more given the challenges that we're still facing with the operating budget. Meanwhile, I have transit lines like the 22 Fillmore that are exceeding pre-COVID ridership weekdays and are at over 150% of pre-COVID ridership weekends. Muni service is back. The only place where we're having challenges attracting riders is peak period commute riders to the financial district, which we do expect will recover steadily but slowly over the next several years. And we need to make sure that our capital infrastructure, particularly the subway, is in good shape in order to support San Francisco's larger economic recovery from the disaster of the pandemic. And with that, I'll close.
30 seconds.
I'll close.
I ask your patience as I come back up on the screen, if that's all right with you.
Sure, Larry.
Thank you. Well, I have to put this chart back up because this is the municipal market for general obligation bonds as of today. This chart is as of 5/11. This is what's happened since the month of March of this year. Yes, 1.8 for AA rated issuers was available when these plans were formulated. AA rated is now at 3.6%. I'm sorry if Mr. Tumlin is not keeping current on developments in the bond market. I think that's unfortunate if he is promoting a $400 million bond measure for the city of San Francisco. I think it's misleading to suggest that Muni is back, that the peak ridership for downtown, yes, it is still somewhere between 2/3 and 75% suppressed. The latest revenue figures published by Muni are for the month of January, and they are 25% of 2019 levels. So revenue is perhaps more meaningful than headcount. The 2015 planning process is very solidly based on the 2045, the Transportation 2045 Committee Planning Framework. They did some great work, but they did some great work for a different city. Work from home, hybrid work. There are significant changes that will require that San Francisco make hard decisions about the future of Muni. And if we don't make those decisions, if we continue that graph that shows forever in the MTA's own planning materials for 2050, forever a gap between revenue and expenditures made up by borrowing, made up by taxpayer subsidies, the system will not serve the citizens of the city of San Francisco. We will not fulfill the vision of Connect SF, of serving the interests of equity, serving the environmental goals, which were so important in 2045, serving racial equity here in the city. Many of the objectives that were so important in the planning for the future of the MTA. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, I need to unshare.
Thank you. And Mr. Marso, my apologies. I do stand corrected. I do know what today's current borrowing rates are. I misinterpreted your earlier chart. So you are correct. And still, the borrowing rates, despite the fact that they are rising, are significantly lower than inflation and still remain a good deal for investments that improve the speed, reliability, and operating efficiency of the Muni system. And that's exactly what we're planning to invest in. Our previous capital plans were about capital expansion. This is about capital efficiency, which is critical to Muni's recovery. And that's exactly, again, the relationship between our capital budget and our operating budget. Unlike in previous decades and previous general managers who papered over Muni's structural deficit by allowing an increase in deferred maintenance, both the capital budget and the operating budget are seeking to reverse decades of what I would call mismanagement of Muni. It's one of the reasons why I came to this agency, is to correct that kind of mismanagement and deferred maintenance, and to help make the system faster, more frequent, more reliable, and better maintained. That is our commitment here. That's exactly what Prop A does, and exactly how it's matched with an operating budget that invests more in maintenance and invests only in as much service as we can actually afford. And I'll close with that.
Thank you. Larry, do you have a brief little rebuttal? Because then we're going to go to questions.
Let's go ahead to questions. Thank you.
Okay. I'm looking for hands. I know we're not all bond experts, but this was interesting. Al.
Yeah, I have a question. So if I work in the peninsula, if I live in the peninsula and work in the Mission, I got to take Caltrain, then I hop on to Muni, and then I hop on to BART. And I'm just wondering, does Proposition A address that issue where all these different services aren't very well integrated?
So Prop A is a capital program, not the operating program. Our operating budget, and particularly the MTC operating budget, include a fare integration pilot that will be starting this year that will eliminate all the transfer penalties to transfer, for example, from Caltrain to Muni. Also, if you were going from Caltrain to the Mission, I'd get off at the 22nd Street station and take the 48th straight to the Mission, or transfer at Millbrae to BART, and it will take you straight there.
Since you mentioned the other regional transportation programs, I want to point out that the $400 million borrowing under this bond represents during the capital plan, during the 10-year capital plan for San Francisco and the region, San Francisco's contribution to regional transportation, including San Francisco and regional systems like Caltrain and BART. This bond constitutes only about 4% of total contribution to all transportation budgets, and only 7% to the capital plan and capital investment plan for Muni. This is a relatively small part of the overall capital plan. The rest of the plan is already fully funded according to plan by local, federal, state, and regional sources, and none of the federal programs that are a part of that funding require that San Francisco borrow money. It's not a term of any of the federal grants that are expected. Build Back Better, which was a part of some of the expected funding that was discussed when formulating this plan, did not pass Congress. And there is some expectation of a different attitude in Congress next year that I think undermines the idea that borrowing under this program is going to trigger or release more federal funds.
Mari.
Oh, hi. I have one question for each of you. For Mr. Tumlin, I'm curious, you keep mentioning, or MTA keeps mentioning, that you want to increase the flow of traffic. And I'd like to know, over the times that you've witnessed it, which areas do you feel like you've actually increased the flow of traffic for the drivers? Could you give me an example of where the traffic has increased or the flow has increased?
Sure. So somewhat unexpectedly, our Van Ness project has improved the flow of car traffic on Van Ness by eliminating the weaving of the buses between the curb and the outside travel lane. This was not something we had expected to the degree that we've observed it, but it has had a significant impact. We've also, through our SF Go program, upgraded the traffic signals through much of the South of Market and the Western Addition, which has allowed us to smooth out the flow of traffic in many of those neighborhoods in order to accommodate the increased amount of driving that we saw just before COVID and that we are seeing again. In addition, we're collaborating with Caltrans on signal upgrades on all of 19th Avenue and Park Presidio, and traffic signal upgrades on all of Geary. This bond would fund a significant number of additional traffic signal upgrades in places like Float and other portions of the South of Market grid.
So I was just interested in what has already improved. So you feel the Van Ness has improved and some of the South of Market area has already improved, and that was the answer. And the others are future. So, okay.
Correct.
Now I had a question also for, I'm sorry, Larry.
Larry, yes.
Yes.
Thanks.
I basically was interested in knowing, I thought I heard somebody mention the fact that some of the bonds you already have bonds that have not been issued for MTA. Do you have any information about unissued bonds that?
It's my understanding that and perhaps you can weigh in here, Mr. Tumlin, that the balance of the 2014 bonds were issued since the beginning of the fiscal year 2020, as much as 150 million of the 500 was issued in just the last year and a half. I believe I saw that in a bond prospectus. So the MTA has had a significant problem with shovel-ready projects. There's a credibility issue with claims about shovel-ready projects. If I could address the question of speed of autos and traffic, I found it a little disturbing when I see the MTA taking credit for improving speed on streets or the declining number of accidents during the pandemic. I think the data is very weak, anecdotal, and it's distasteful, frankly, when they're trying to market a bond. The Safe Streets program, which has primarily been 400 barriers erected around the city under the Quick Build program, as I understand it. This bond, again, of course, this bond doesn't require anything technically, but the planning is to convert many of those barriers to permanent. And rather than to maintain the flexibility to be able to quickly, move them around in response to changes, as the city will be rapidly changing post-pandemic.
I would be happy to respond to the mistruths there, but we can also move on.
Okay, well, we can move on. Glenn.
Yes, thank you. This is a question for Jeffery Tumlin. The controller's office did not encourage your bond measure and thought that it might be better served at another point in time, maybe after you had a series of better history of finance use. Do you feel they're being overly protective of city money? Do you think they have a good point, the controller's office?
So the controller's office fully supported our bond. They have extensively audited our large capital projects that we're closing out this year. And we agree with almost all of their audit findings and have taken steps to learn from those hard lessons. And again, this bond program doesn't have any enormous capital expansion projects in it. It is mostly the sort of stuff that we are very good at, like the 5 Fulton project or the 9 San Bruno project, the work that we've done so far in the middle stretch of Geary. Those have delivered up to 20% speed and reliability improvements to Muni at 10 to 20% of the cost of our previous capital projects.
So
Larry,
so the criticism that you refer to is available in a memo from the controller that was written to the mayor, the board of supervisor, and to Mr. Tumlin. And it critiques the forecasts that, again, are the foundation for Transportation 2050 and the planning for the bond. It found over 550 million of surplus funds in the 5-year forecast, more than the amount of the borrowing in the bond. The idea that this 400 million is essential for this spending as a part of an over $4.7 billion capital plan for the which is otherwise fully funded over the 10 years capital plan of the city of San Francisco. It is not tenable in a post-pandemic era where we all need to reassess, reevaluate. And, you know, many of the other programs that are borrowing under the general obligation fund of the city do not have revenue sources. The MTA should not be accessing the limited capacity of our general obligation programs. The controller, the city capital plan acknowledges that the general obligation bond program of the city is near capacity. There are $4 billion of bonds already issued, $1.2 billion of bonds authorized, not yet issued. And look at those municipal bond rates. That is what the government has to go out and negotiate on those rates. And that is a trend, folks. It's a trend up. And the idea that this is the right place to obtain financing, that at these rates, these capital projects make sense. It's time for the taxpayer to send a message here that it's time for some post-pandemic thinking that we're not getting from our city officials.
George, it's after 8. We need to make this to be your last question.
That's fine. That would be me. I'm happy for the chance. First off, I want to say you both done a great job, and we really appreciate that you're here. My first question would be, obviously there's Prop K, which is a 0.5-cent tax till 2030 that goes to Muni. Obviously there's the general fund that goes to Muni. The 2014 bond, Mr. Marso is correct. I read that there was $134 million in the third tranche, and I doubt you spent more than 30 million of it. So you still have at least $110 million. On top of that, the bond rate, every point up increases the rate that the homeowner is going to have to pay in their property tax. On top of that, the way this works is not the way you started. You start, because I've been on bond committees for the mayor, and it's always the same, where the city government tells us when a bond is retired, there's a gap, and we will fill that gap. That's not true, because I've been on the bond committees. What they do is a city assessor goes in and says the value of the city is now higher, and then creates a larger gap where the city could now borrow more. On top of that, you have an upcoming $89 million COP for road, 30 million of it to roads. So, and then on top of that, in November, you have another 0.5-cent tax in it, which will be just as big as Prop K. So you'll be getting an entire penny. And what I see happening here is a slush fund. You're not moving fast enough, and you're going to be acquiring an awful lot of money. So my question is, what are you going to do with the massive amount of money that you are collecting?
So first of all, let me correct a couple of facts there. So while we have not spent all of the money in our previous bond authorization, that money is encumbered. So for example, we have projects like rebuilding the Alteraval line where the train tracks haven't been touched in nearly 100 years. That project will be spending its capital budget over the next 2 to 3 years. So that money isn't spent, but it's encumbered. It's also important to note that the only other item that's on the November ballot is a reauthorization of our existing sales tax. So we have no slush fund. Moreover, if this bond gets approved, we don't get any of that money. It's not like somebody writes us an enormous check. We get to issue bonds as we get ready to expend things in the city's overall capital program. The city manages overall spending in the capital program to make sure that it's not issuing bonds at too fast a rate, because they need to stay below that 2006 property tax cap. So we only have the eligibility to issue bonds for our projects when previous bonds get spent and there's a gap between what is currently indebted and that cap. Moreover, I really want to emphasize, we have completely changed all of our planning approaches. I started this job just before the pandemic. I've only existed in this job basically during a pandemic. All of the work that my team has done is informed by the pandemic. I am not building on the T2045 plan, I'm building on the T2050 plan, which is all about post-pandemic recovery and supporting the city's larger economic recovery. If this bond doesn't pass, we're going to be shrinking the Muni system pretty significantly. And San Francisco cannot have an economic recovery if we're expecting everyone to drive to all of those jobs in the financial district and in our neighborhoods. We are no longer demolishing neighborhoods in order to widen streets and highways. We have no choice but to accommodate San Francisco's growth and economic recovery by prioritizing the most space-efficient modes of transportation. Like, I'm not a better person when I ride Muni, but I take 1/10 of the space as I do when I drive a car. And so investment in Muni's capital program is an investment in San Francisco's economic recovery. It's an investment in the livability of the city. It's an investment in equity. And it's the only thing that will make it possible for all of you to be able to continue to drive when you want to drive. And that is to make it possible for other San Franciscans to not be forced to drive when they don't want to drive. So we need to make sure that Muni service is there in order to serve San Francisco's economic recovery and a very different San Francisco that we're expecting a couple of years from now.
Thank you.
Well, George, you make some very good points about the general obligation bond programs of the city. The idea that in the post-pandemic era, that the so-called 2006 cap, which is nothing but a policy that the city likes to talk about, likes to promote, uses to try to assure taxpayers on the eve of the vote on a bond measure that their taxes are not going to go up. I showed you the chart by the tax assessor of the city of San Francisco showing rates going up and up and up. And that rate is 1% plus the funds that are necessary to pay the general obligation bonds of the city of San Francisco and other jurisdictions, including the community college board, the school district, and the regional authorities like BART, which all have the authority to issue general obligation bonds. We have to operate within that context. It affects whether it is sensible for a Muni to borrow this amount of money. When we take a look at those incredible, rapidly rising municipal bond rates, it will have an effect on whether the city can hold to this policy they like to talk about. They're free to raise rates, raise tax rates as much as necessary to pay for the $1.4 billion unauthorized, including significant funds for affordable housing and spending on homeless services that were authorized during the pandemic by the voters. If this bond passes, why did Jonathan Ruers keep showing up to debates with me saying that they were going to borrow the bulk of the funds in the first 3 years. Why did he keep showing up and doing that while all of the plans say it is going to be a measured borrowing over the course of 10 years? Very curious why he would do that in order to promote that the bonds were essential. Listen, we need to start thinking about the concepts of transit first. Is transit first really the first best policy at a time when so many San Franciscans have learned to work remote? Or the economic system has moved on to where a daily commute is no longer mandatory. Employers have figured out how not to have downtown offices. Listen, it's not great for the city of San Francisco's business tax revenues, but should the city be promoting the use of vehicles, expending energy, sometimes emitting greenhouse gases, and in order to continue to keep our system at a pre-pandemic levels? It's important, if we're going to have a smaller transit system as in response to the realities of the post-pandemic era, that we figure out how to concentrate those resources on the people Mr. Tumlin was talking about. People who
Larry,
need.
I'm going to have to cut you off, Larry, but Director Tumlin, thank you so much. We're honored that you would take time out of your evening to spend with us. And you too, Larry. Good points by all. And how we do it, I think Director Tumlin didn't hear.